One more time on the Odyssey. Our last lecture on Homer. This will also be, of course, the last lecture in the whole part of our course that we have spent up until now in the ancient world, the ancient Greek world, first with Sophocles and then going back even farther to the Odyssey. At the beginning of the course, I said that we were going to learn, I hope, a couple of different kinds of things, one of them being stuff that I organized under the unusual category of facts, some historical and anthropological facts about the history, some aspects of the history of human culture, which I hope are just simply interesting in and of themselves. And so I hope that we've learned some things over the last 6 weeks, I guess it is, about the ancient Greek world, which seem to you guys worth knowing. I also said, though, that we were going to be pursuing a theme, as you know, an investigation into a certain complex, fascinating topic, and that's what I want to pursue today by way of wrapping up our look at the Odyssey and at our ancient texts in general. The topic, of course, the theme is the theme of recognition, the experience of getting something, the experience of understanding something. The operative theory, let's say, that we have had, just to review a bit, is twofold, I guess. Part of it is that literary texts tend to function for us as sites of recognition. That's something that I focused on as strongly as I could, I guess, in the first couple of lectures of the course. But the other aspect, or the other kind of vector of our thought here, is that a lot of classic literary texts are in effect about recognition, and that's what we have been pursuing for the most part ever since we started our work with Sophocles. So in Oedipus the King, as you guys recall, we were looking at that text as being about tragic recognition, about recognition as tragic in various ways, being painful, being difficult, being perhaps necessarily beyond us or out of our control, perhaps also forcing us to submit to social structures of information and authority, as Oedipus and Jocasta are forced in the end to submit to the system of prophecies and oracles as they are dispatched by the gods. In the case of the Odyssey, the register, let's say, of recognition, I think, is somewhat different. We could say, perhaps, that in the Odyssey we're looking at questions of personal recognition or moral recognition, and then recognition as a moral issue. I mean, recognition in the Odyssey being a pointer or a thread that leads perhaps toward the very possibility of morality as a system and a code for human conduct that goes beyond and controls, restrains mere following of urges, pleasure, self-interest, power, violence, all of that stuff that dominates the world of the Odyssey. As we have already discussed, the thread of that potential morality in the world of the Odyssey certainly seems to be provided by the code of Xenia or hospitality, and Xenia or hospitality seems to be there as a system and an institution in the ancient Greek world precisely to allow and to facilitate recognition. Recognition of the other, the stranger who comes to your door. You don't kill him, you don't drive him away, you invite him in, and if all goes well under that Homeric Xenia, you then become capable of not only spending time with the stranger, but actually recognizing the stranger as a guest friend, as somebody you're glad to see, and maybe were already glad to see, even though you didn't realize it until that moment of recognition occurs. From the other way around, in the Xenia procedure, the stranger is getting known as a guest, that is, as a guest friend. This happens over and over again in the Odyssey. The stranger, it turns out, has in a sense already been there. He's already your friend. He already has a claim or a tie on Xenia. He is somebody who belongs. And if and when that happens, recognizing and getting recognized, we have a moral bond that is established between host and guest. The obsession with that procedure, with the establishment of that bond that we have in the Odyssey is evident. It's what the whole poem is about. And even the bad stuff that happens to Odysseus and his companions, as we have discussed, those are basically distortions or inversions of Xenia. Nothing could be more important then in the world of the Odyssey than recognizing and getting recognized, and yet seemingly nothing could be more difficult either. What I want to try to do in this final lecture is make some sense of that. And I want to do that by focusing on the figure of Odysseus himself, who has to fight, of course, for 10 years to get home to Ithaca, and yet then, in a strange way, has to fight to be home, to be seen, recognized as what and who he is, on his own island, in his own house, by his own family, and so on. And of course, there is, in those last, 10 books, I guess, of the Odyssey, there is, so to speak, a kind of straightforward narrative reason why it's hard for Odysseus to get recognized, or why recognition is such a problematic element in that concluding portion of his story. It's because of those suitors who are occupying his house, and supposedly if they see him, they will kill him, and so on. That's true. But I don't think that exhausts the question that is before us today. And the question is, why is it so hard for Odysseus to be seen as who he is, where he is, at home? Why is it so hard for him to be recognized? Why is it so hard to come home? That's the question. And we can begin to try to answer it just by identifying what are the major scenes of recognition between Odysseus and those people who know him in these last books of the Odyssey. And we can identify 4 main scenes that we want to work with. I don't mean specific passages, I mean episodes, if you like. First of all, the whole extended episode between Odysseus and Eumaeus, the swineherd, to whose hut Odysseus goes when he first arrives back on Ithaca. That's in book 24 of the Odyssey. Odysseus is in disguise. He does not actually reveal himself or get recognized by Eumaeus until book 21. So Odysseus and Eumaeus, that's one of the kind of axes, let's say, of recognition that we have in the story. The second one, of course, would be Odysseus and Telemachus, his son, who comes home to Ithaca himself in book 16, and Odysseus, in fact, reveals himself to Telemachus, but in a way that we will talk about later on. Third, and very, very famously and importantly and awesomely, I think, would be the axis of recognition between Odysseus and Eurycleia, his old nurse. And this involves an episode that we will work closely with in this lecture in book 19. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the axis of recognition between Penelope and Odysseus. Penelope, Odysseus' wife, obviously, and her husband, who has finally returned. He first sort of sets eyes on her and she on him in book 17 of the Odyssey, but the recognition scene does not occur or is not completed until book 23. It is a very, very long process in which this wife manages to know this husband, and the husband manages to get known by her. In each case, Odysseus's trajectory toward, or journey toward, recognition on Ithaca, in each case the journey begins with lies. And of course Odysseus is called the Lord of Lies, Lord of Craft, and all that stuff. spinning tales, telling fictions. When Odysseus approaches Eumaeus' hut in book 14, the swineherd sees this stranger, this seemingly old beggar approaching his hut, and the scene of Xenia that we have already witnessed over and over again in the Odyssey is played one more time as the swineherd rushes outside, invites this beggar in, makes him comfortable, bustles around, giving him a meal. It's very much like Odysseus is kind of testing out Eumaeus to see if he'll do the Xenia thing properly, and he does. Odysseus is actually very, very pleased at how hospitable his swineherd is. And then, of course, once the meal has been served, the old beggar, seeming beggar, has been sated, then Eumaeus asks him, okay, who are you? What's your story? That next stage in the Xenia procedure, who are you? We move to the moment of potential knowing, potential recognition. Now, Odysseus, he doesn't merely decline or evade the question. You know, he doesn't say, oh, my name isn't important. Of course, he doesn't just say, I'm Odysseus either. What Odysseus does is he actively frustrates Eumaeus' attempt to find out who he is. Odysseus tells a whole long story of who he supposedly is, where he's supposedly from. He's supposed to be from Crete. We learn about his whole fictitious career. We learn the name of his father. We also learn that this beggar supposedly knows Odysseus himself. It's a kind of perfect lie that Odysseus himself spins in answer to Eumaeus' question about who he actually is. And at the same time, within this lying tale, the story that Odysseus tells, a story that is not about him, but about a fictitious person he supposedly is, the story that Odysseus tells in a strange way or a covert way, it kind of is about him, or at least it sounds an awful lot like him. And I'm going to turn now to book 14 at roundabout line 216, where Odysseus, in this other persona, is talking about himself, this fictitious story of his life. And he says, I have the gift of courage from Athena and from Ares. Whenever I chose warriors to ambush our enemies, I never thought of death. I leapt out far in front and ran to catch them and spear them. That was how I was in war. I did not like farm work or housekeeping or raising children. I liked sailing better and war with spears and arrows, deadly weapons. Others may shudder at such things, but gods made my heart love them. People's preferences are different. You know, I was never very good with the house stuff or raising children. No, basically, I liked fighting. Odysseus says in the persona of this strange old beggar. Okay, that sounds an awful lot like you know who. You know what I mean? Odysseus, who sailed off to war when his one child was a baby and now hasn't seen him for 20 years. Odysseus spins a story in response to Eumaeus' question, the question of identity. The story is a fiction, and yet the story, in a strange way, is a revealing fiction. It is a fiction about himself, even though under covers, under wraps, so to speak. Now, we've seen this kind of thing before in the Odyssey. In a previous lecture, I drew your attention to a couple of episodes earlier in the poem. One of them, that marvelous one from the end of Book 8 and into Book 9, where Odysseus reveals himself in the palace of the Phaeacians because the poet, the bard Demodocus, starts singing a song about him, about Odysseus. Odysseus is overwhelmed, and recognition follows. And I suggested at that time, that's sort of how it is supposed to work in the Xenia procedure in the Odyssey. Stories are there, fiction is there, literature is there after the meal. And the presence of those fictional stories, that's precisely part of how the recognition is able to occur in those other episodes of the Odyssey, but not here. Odysseus' story, for some reason or other, just goes on and on and on. Eumaeus is not only unmoved by the story, he actually does not buy it one bit. Um, um, Odysseus has been telling this fake story. He's been saying, oh yeah, and I know Odysseus too, and I hear he's coming back really soon. Eumaeus says now in book 14 at line 361, he says, poor guest, your tale of woe was very moving, but pointless. I will not believe a word about Odysseus. Why did you stoop to tell those silly lies? I know about my master's homecoming. The gods detest him. They loathe him, since they did not let him die at Troy or in his friend's arms, etc. We get a very similar kind of thing happen when Odysseus finally makes it to his house in book 17 and thereafter, when he finds himself talking to Eurycleia, his old nurse, when he finds himself talking to Penelope, his wife, in that context of hospitality. Odysseus starts telling stories. The stories are false. The stories are actually about him. And the stories actually kind of point to him. He always says, oh yeah, I met Odysseus, and here's what he was wearing, and I think he's coming home soon. We're seeing, this is the point that I'm trying to make, we're seeing that part of the Xenia movie playing again, the part where a story is told after dinner, and the telling of the story about Odysseus after dinner is supposed to produce recognition. That's how it has worked earlier in the Odyssey, but not here. However long Odysseus' stories are, however about him they are, however kind of hinty they are, they don't work. It's as though in this final crucial phase of the Odyssey, when Odysseus needs to come home and be recognized, it's as though Homer is reaching for the Xenia machine that always makes that happen. And yet, for some reason, the Xenia machine is broken. Recognition does not follow, does not occur after the telling of those stories. How then does Odysseus actually get recognized by these people we've pointed to, Eumaeus, Telemachus, Eurycleia, and Penelope? In book 16, Telemachus arrives at Eumaeus' house. He initially sits down with this old stranger. They have a bit of a talk. Eumaeus then goes off to town. Athena appears to Odysseus and she says, look, it's time to reveal yourself to your kid. She transforms his appearance so that when he walks back into the hut, Telemachus says, oh my gosh, who are you? You look like a god. Odysseus says, no, I am your father, and the recognition scene occurs. How does Odysseus get recognized by Telemachus? How does it become possible for Telemachus to know him and for Odysseus to be known by Telemachus? Well, that occurs, you guys, through divine intervention. A god, Athena, steps in and goes, whoop, and the recognition occurs. And we can use and learn a phrase for this kind of solving of a problem, a narrative problem in a story. It's a phrase that's used when a plot comes to a resolution, either by coincidence or just kind of arbitrarily. The phrase is Deus ex machina, and I'll put that on the Canvas page. Don't worry about the spelling. Deus ex machina. That's a Latin phrase which literally means a god operating out of the mechanism, or a god operating out of the machine. It's a phrase that we use, again, for moments in a story when a difficult plot problem is resolved just like that. Deus ex machina, either by coincidence or because the author just suddenly resolves it without any very good reason or clever device. So it's a kind of cheating, you see, when a problem in a story is resolved Deus ex machina, and that is, in fact, how the recognition problem is resolved between Odysseus and Telemachus. It's like the old story of the Gordian knot that nobody could untie until Alexander the Great comes along, cuts the knot with his sword and solves the problem. How can Odysseus get recognized by Telemachus? Well, Homer just cuts the knot. Athena comes in, makes it happen. It's Deus ex machina. We will find something very similar happen in the other recognition scenes of this final section of the Odyssey. when Odysseus comes to his palace and his feet are washed by his old nurse Eurycleia, she discovers this scar on the stranger's leg and she recognizes Odysseus. Now we're going to come back to that in just a moment. It's a really incredible passage that we can say a lot about. But for the moment, I just want to make the point clear that that scar thing, again, that's Deus ex machina. That's Homer just solving the recognition problem just like that, cutting the knot. How does Eurycleia recognize Odysseus? Well, it so happens Odysseus has this scar. And Odysseus is the only guy in the world who has this scar, and therefore, the guy who has this scar, that's Odysseus. It's solved arbitrarily or by fiat. And in fact, later, when Odysseus reveals himself to Eumaeus, he actually does that through the scar as well. He says, look, I'm Odysseus, here's my scar. An identifying mark, not a kind of interesting or moving solution to the recognition problem at all, which means the recognition problem remains. It is not resolved. And the final example that we can give there would be how Odysseus is finally recognized by Penelope in, I guess it's book 23. You know, he has arrived. He's been hanging around for a long time. He has been talking to her and to Eurycleia. He's killed all the suitors and then cleaned up. Finally, he sits down with Penelope and he's ready to go. Like, you know, it's me. It's me. And she won't buy it. What makes her accept that it's Odysseus is, again, a sign, a kind of Deus ex machina sign. It so happens, we learn, that Odysseus built this bed around an olive tree trunk in their house, and only he and Penelope know about that. So when she slyly says, hey, well, you know, I moved my bed, and Odysseus freaks out and says, oh, you moved my bed? Nobody could move that bed. It's exactly like the scar. It so happens there's this bed thing that only Penelope and Odysseus know about, and therefore Odysseus knowing about that bed thing, that must be him, and that is how she accepts that it's him. That's how he is recognized. The recognition occurs arbitrarily. It's forced by Homer. And that means that the recognition as a problem remains. It is not resolved. It's just kind of cut like that Gordian knot. Now I want to spend a few minutes actually with the recognition scene in book 19 when Eurycleia, Odysseus' old nurse, washes his feet and touches the scar. And I want to do that both because it's very extremely awesome and because I think it allows us, as we begin to wrap up our work with the Odyssey, it allows us, I think, to be able to say why recognition is so hard in the world of the Odyssey and what is at stake in that moral difficulty that this poem has. So we're going to turn now, please, to book 19. It will be from around line 385, I guess, on page 437 in our course books. The scene of Eurycleia washing Odysseus's feet, which I'm going to read. Homer writes, then the old woman took the shining cauldron used for a foot bath, and she filled it up with water, lots of cold, a splash of hot. Odysseus sat there beside the hearth and hurriedly turned round to face the darkness. He had a premonition in his heart that when she touched him, she would feel his scar, and all would be revealed. She kneeled beside him and washed her master. Suddenly she felt the scar. A white-tusked boar had wounded him on Mount Parnassus long ago. He went there with his maternal cousins and grandfather, noble Autolycus, who was the best of all mankind at telling lies and stealing. Hermes gave him this talent to reward him for burning many offerings to him. Much earlier, Autolycus had gone to Ithaca to see his daughter's baby, and Eurycleia put the newborn child on his grandfather's lap and said, now name your grandson, this much-wanted baby boy. He told the parents, name him this. I am disliked by many all across the world, and I dislike them back. So name the child Odysseus. And when he is a man, let him come to his mother's people's house by Mount Parnassus. I will give him treasure and send him home rejoicing. When he grew, Odysseus came there to claim his gifts. His cousins and Autolycus embraced him and greeted him with friendly words of welcome. His grandma, Amphitheia, wrapped her arms around him like a vine and kissed his face and shining eyes. Autolycus instructed his sons to make the dinner. They obeyed and brought a bull of 5 years old and flayed it and chopped it all in pieces and then sliced the meat with skill and portioned it on skewers and roasted it with care and shared it out, and everybody got the same amount. The whole day long they feasted till the sun went down and darkness fell. Then they lay down and took the gift of sleep. When early dawn the newborn child with rosy hands appeared, Autolycus went hunting with his dogs and with his sons. Odysseus went too. Up the steep wooded side of Mount Parnassus they climbed and reached its windswept folds. The sun rose from the calmly flowing depths of ocean to touch the fields. Just as the hunters came into a glen, the dogs had dashed in front looking for tracks. Autolycus' sons came after, with Odysseus, who kept close to the dogs and brandished his long spear. A mighty boar lurked there. Its lair was thick, protected from the wind. The golden sun could never strike at it with shining rays, and rain could not get in. There was a pile of fallen leaves inside it. The boar had heard the sound of feet. The men and dogs were near. Out of his hiding place he leapt to face them, his bristles standing up, his eyes like fire, and stood right next to them. Odysseus was first to rush at him. His long spear gripped tight in his hand. He tried to strike. The boar struck first above his knee, and charging sideways, scooped a great hunk of flesh off with his tusk, but did not reach the bone. Odysseus wounded the boar's right shoulder, and the spear pierced through. The creature howled and fell to earth. His life flew out. Autolycus' sons bustled around and skillfully bound up the wound received by great Odysseus, and stopped the black blood with a charm, and took him back to their father's house, and nursed him well, then gave him splendid gifts, and promptly sent him back home to Ithaca, and he was glad. His parents welcomed him and asked him questions, wanting to know how he had got the wound. He told them he was hunting with his cousins on Mount Parnassus, and a boar attacked him. The white tusk pierced his leg. The old slave woman, holding his leg and rubbing with flat palms, came to that place and recognized the scar. She let his leg fall down into the basin. It clattered, tilted over, and the water spilled out across the floor. Both joy and grief took hold of her. Her eyes were filled with tears. Her voice was choked. She touched his beard and said, "You are Odysseus, my darling child." Okay. What happens when that scar gets touched by Eurycleia in Odysseus, Book 19? It is a very famous episode, a very characteristic episode in Homer. It's also a challenging episode for us as readers who are not accustomed, perhaps, to epic narrative, because it's a digression that we go into when Eurycleia touches the scar. We get a whole story about where that scar came from, and that story goes on and on and on and on. It's easy to get confused about where we are. We're in a digression. We're in a backstory behind the story of how Odysseus got his scar. Now, this is a famous insight about Homeric narrative. I mean about the way Homer writes his story. It's not my insight, it's a classic one. And it's a little bit difficult to put or explain, but the idea, if I can explain it, is this. In any kind of story, we're going to be able to recognize a difference between, let's say, the story and the background, or maybe the story and the backstory. There's a difference between what's just plain happening in the story. Yeah? I'm getting up, I'm making breakfast, I'm walking to the bus to go to SFU. There's a difference between just what's happening in that story and all the stuff that's kind of around the story. The scene, the various objects that fill the scene, coffee pot, oranges, bus, and the backstories which are imaginable behind all of those objects. And if we were telling that story that I just sketched, I got up, I had coffee, I went to the bus, we would probably leave a lot out, right? We're not going to talk about where we got the coffee from. We're not going to describe the factory that made the bus. We're not going to give a whole account of the cultural background of the bus driver. No, we're going to leave everything out. That all drops out. We just focus on the story. The background is relegated to the shadows. Homer doesn't work that way. As it has been famously put, Homer knows no background. Homer knows no background. Which simply means that whatever Homer looks at, he tells. Whatever corner of the Homerverse, as I've called it, Homer directs his attention toward in the course of writing the Odyssey, he tells that story. The story is filled in completely. This episode in Book 19 being, of course, the most spectacular example. We don't just see the scar. We don't just see Eurycleia recognizing the scar. We don't just even get Homer saying, oh, by the way, yeah, so Odysseus has this scar. And so when she sees it, she recognizes him. Got it? No. We get a whole long story about how Odysseus got that scar. We drop from the main story down into a backstory. And the backstory itself opens up into epic scope. And that brings us to another element in this incredible moment in the Odyssey. What do we get when we touch Odysseus's scar? What's in that backstory that we see the story of how Odysseus got that scar? We go from the story to the digression, from the action of the poem to something else entirely, another world, the world of that scar. What's in that other world in Homer? Well, I added, by way of contrast to our Canvas page, a link. And it's not just for fun. In this case, I think it's actually a wonderful thing. It's a link to a very famous, it's a link to a YouTube clip, which is drawn from a very famous episode of Star Trek, The Next Generation, the early 90s series. The clip is from an episode of Star Trek, The Next Generation, which is legendary among Trekkies. I'm not one, but like I hear. Legendary among Trekkies, and I think with reason, because it really was a very, very excellent piece of network television at the time, 1992, I believe, is when it aired first. What happens in this episode is that, as those of you guys who've watched it or watched the clip will know, what happens in this episode is that Picard is on the bridge of the Enterprise, and they encounter a strange kind of rocket coming up, an unmanned ship. It probes or scans Picard, and he falls down on the floor of the bridge, seemingly in a fit, unconscious, unresponsive. And he's non-responsive on the floor of the bridge of the Enterprise for something like 15 minutes. In that 15 minutes, however, Picard leads and lives a whole other life. He finds himself on this planet where he's never been before. He's got a wife. He's got friends. They all know him. He doesn't know them. Initially, he's resistant. He says, this is a mistake. This is some kind of weird dream or alien intervention. I'm a starship captain. I've got to get back to my ship. But eventually he gives up because this other life goes on for years and years. Eventually he accepts what has happened. He comes to love his wife. He has children. They grow up. And he, in fact, grows to be an old man in this other life that he is experiencing until at the very end of the episode, and this was the clip that I shared with you. At the very end of the episode, he realizes that what happened was that this lost civilization, this dead civilization, had sent up a probe to the Enterprise. They'd scanned him and given him this experience so that he would know what their world had been like. So at the very end of the episode, the clip that I connected to the Canvas page, old Picard, who has lived his whole life, he thinks, on this other planet, suddenly comes to the recognition that, oh, That was not real after all. That was another world. And there's that wonderful, really, I think, superb moment when Patrick Stewart, as Picard, realizes that it has been kind of a dream after all. And he says, oh, it's me. Recognizes the truth about what has happened to him. So the point I want to make, the contrasting point I want to make about that wonderful Star Trek episode is this. In a story like that one, when Picard falls out of his life into a digression, so to speak, a digression that takes up seemingly decades, he falls into another world entirely. It's utterly different from the life that he has been living up to that point. And it's precisely because he goes into another world that the moment at the end of that episode is so incredible and so moving when he comes back to his own world. He recognizes the truth. So in a story like that one, when we go from story to digression, we go from one world to another world, a different world. That's not how it works in the Odyssey. That's not how it works in the episode of Book 19 where we learn about Odysseus and his scar. The story that we get when Eurycleia touches that scar, it is exactly the same kind of story about exactly the same kind of world as we're in when Eurycleia is actually touching that scar in Odysseus' palace. And that itself is exactly the same kind of story about exactly the same kind of world that we have been in ever since we started reading the Odyssey in Book 1. The Odyssey, this long, repetitious tour of the Homerverse where we always find the same values, the same scenes, the same heroes, the same meal, the same meat, the same wine, the same slaves, and so on. Homer tells the story of the scar and tells it wholly and completely. But the story of the scar is just another story of the Odyssey. It's just another area of what we've been calling the Homerverse, and it looks exactly the same as every other area of the Homerverse. Homer can't imagine another world. Insofar as he tries to imagine another world, it just looks like another copy of his world, the world of the Odyssey, another instance, another reflection of it. And I've talked in previous lectures about the overwhelming, almost unbearable sameness of the world of the Odyssey, no matter where these heroes go. It's culturally the same, linguistically the same, religiously the same, even geographically the same. The only exception to that being, of course, the monstrous difference in the world of the Odyssey can only be understood as monstrous. In every other way, it's just the same old Homerverse over and over and over again. And the point that I'm making now is that that sameness of Homer also extends to the world of Homer's narrative itself, the way Homer's story itself works. It's, I think, worth making as a kind of side note here that even when we come to the end of the Odyssey, we don't really seem to come to the end of the Odyssey. And this is something that many readers have remarked on, or all readers, I guess, remark on. After the big reveal, after Odysseus and Penelope go to bed, after the family is back together, what happens? Well, a war. A war happens as Odysseus has to defend himself against the families of the suitors. It's as though the Odyssey is just going on and on and on and on. It's as though there's no escape in Homer from Homer's world. It's just same, 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 same again. Okay. What does this have to do with the question of recognition and why it is so hard for Odysseus to be recognized, why it is so hard for Odysseus to come home? That moment of Star Trek where Picard says, oh, it's me. He comes back to himself. He returns to his life. He is able to do that in the last analysis for one very basic, simple, indispensable, and obvious reason. He is able to return to his life precisely because he has been away from his life, right? He has been in another life, in another world. He has been in the realm of difference. And because he has been in the realm of difference, and precisely for that reason, he's able to come back to the same and experience it as the same. He's able to come home because he has been away. And maybe that's a large part of the reason why we go away. We go away so that we can come home. And in fact, it is only people who have been away who can come home. To put this in a slightly different way, and maybe a clearer way, recognition, I think, actually depends on difference, right? You know, let's say that you think back to when you were in grade 3, okay? It could be any grade, but let's say grade 3. You're in grade 3, you had a best friend in grade 3. So you're in grade 3, you have a best friend. One day you're walking down the hall at school, you see your best friend. Now, nothing really happens there. You don't really recognize your best friend in grade 3 because he's your best friend, or she, and you're in grade 3 together. You see that kid every day. Walk down the hall, there's your best friend. Great. Perfectly normal, nothing very surprising. But then suppose that you are in university, you're at SFU, you're walking down the crowded hallways of the SFU AQ on level 3000, and we are going to be doing that once again one of these days. You're walking down the crowded hallways of the SFU AQ on the 3000 level. You see random student coming toward you in the crowd of random students who are flowing in all directions, and your mind is going, yeah, random student, oh my gosh, that's my best friend from grade 3. And you recognize that person. The recognition is able to happen only because the difference has intervened, only because a stranger approached, and you were able then to recognize that stranger as a friend you welcome as a guest. Recognition depends on difference. The world of the Odyssey struggles to understand or incorporate difference. And I think, in the last analysis, that is why it is so incredibly difficult for recognition to make sense when Odysseus comes home. That is why I think it is so hard for Odysseus to get recognized. Odysseus can't come back to himself as the same because Odysseus can't be lost in difference. That just isn't an option for a Homeric hero. To put that again in the other way, the reason it's so incredibly hard for Odysseus to come home is because Odysseus has never really been away. He has never been external to the Homerverse, because there's no such thing as that in Homer. Homer can't imagine getting outside of his world. Because Odysseus has just been in the same world all the time of the Odyssey, we can't have that kind of moment that we have in the Star Trek episode, where he suddenly returns to his world, returns to his home. He can't come home, because he's never really left home. He's always been in just another corner, another reflection of the same world. At the same time, and by that same token, I think we can note that Homer does not understand difference. And it's because Homer does not understand difference that he can't make sense of recognition, not fully. At the same time, though, I think we can say Homer is kind of obsessed with this thing that Homer can't understand. We see him throughout the poem reaching for recognition, setting up scenes of recognition, trying to achieve moments of recognition over and over and over again through the incessant scenes and the obsessive theme of Xenia in the Odyssey. When the stranger is revealed as a friend under that shock, what I've called in the title of this lecture, the shock of the you. That depends on difference. The Homerverse doesn't really do difference, but through the thread of Xenia, I think, Homer is trying to do difference, trying to grasp or generate or incorporate difference in his world. Now, the incorporation of difference in the Homeric world would, I think, be fatal to the Homeric world. And that means that the vision of this Homeric universe, this vision that Homer has, is in a sense trying to destroy itself precisely by way of morally reforming itself. We've talked a lot about the moral horror that we find, for the most part, in the world of the Odyssey. It's either an immoral or an amoral world, with that one exception, that exception of Xenia, which, as I've been arguing here today, is precisely supposed to function as an engine of recognition. And I want to wrap up by stating that the struggle that I think we find in Homer is precisely the struggle to recognize, to grasp, to understand recognition itself. That thread coming out of the Odyssey, that's what Homer offers as, let's say, a potentially moral fabric. And that's where I think we can stop our look at this poem and what it has to say about our theme.